Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. We are a pay and reward consultancy supporting organisations of all sizes and sectors to take a fair and equitable approach to pay, communicated clearly and honestly to employees. In this podcast, we invite experts to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the world of HR, culture and leadership. We're keen to explore how we can all work to overcome and navigate these challenges. So, tune in to explore how you could create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to.
I'm Rameez, your host, and in today's episode, we're discussing why it's really important to have pay conversations in the workplace and how to do this. Now, imagine you're an HR manager, you're a line manager for a team, and somebody in your team comes to you with salaries that they've taken off Glassdoor, Indeed, or other recruitment sites, and they're demanding a pay rise because they feel they're underpaid. Now, most managers don't get any training on how to lead their team, and hardly anyone gets any training on how to have meaningful pay conversations with people in their team. But this is a crucial part of any manager's job, and it's one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why many people leave their jobs. So today we're going to be discussing this with our guest and my colleague, Jenna Thompson, who is our reward communications manager at 3R Strategy. Welcome to the podcast, Jenna.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
So, well, you're part of the team, so I had no choice but to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, it's really sweet. Thank you so much.
Yeah, recognition is one of my strong points as a manager. So, I mean, this is a topic that comes up a lot for HR professionals, for a lot of our clients. And in your conversations with clients, or I know that, we've both been reading a lot of books around these topics, not necessarily paid, but just difficult or important conversations. But why do you think it's so important for managers and HR people not to avoid conversations around pay, but to be prepared to have these important conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to trust, doesn't it? And I think, the temptation is often to avoid these conversations because they can feel uncomfortable, or maybe people don't feel prepared for them or know how to talk about it. Money can be a bit of a contentious issue. But I think it's really important that we talk about it. And I think particularly as the workforce is starting to expect more pay transparency from organizations, it just becomes one of those things that actually you can't avoid. And the longer you avoid it and the longer you put it off, just the worse it's going to get. And people will come to their own conclusions one way or another. So, yeah, I think it's really important that we're having them. That we're having them in the right way, and that people don't feel that you are trying to pull the wool over their eyes or hide something, because what they're going to imagine is probably going to be so much worse than the reality.
Yeah, we often hear that, don't we, that they're imagining so much things are going to be so much worse. And I think what you often find is that people come to you with pay questions or information, but actually a lot of the time it's not so much the number that they're unhappy with, but it's that feeling of I'm not being paid fairly. And it's I think part of the reason why maybe some managers or HR avoid these conversations is they're thinking, well, if we have this conversation, we're going to have to make a pay adjustment. But that's not necessarily the case. It's around making that person feel heard and making them feel like they are being treated fairly.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
if we think about our objective is to try and make that person feel heard, try and make them feel like they're treated fairly, what would your advice be on a manager who is looking to approach this conversation Or if if you're speaking to a client, what would you recommend to them?
Well, I think if your objective is for somebody to feel heard, then at risk of sounding really obvious, then you probably just need to hear them. Like if someone's approached you, or if you've got that conversation coming up, I think doing your preparation, but actually giving that person a chance to, if someone's coming to you and they think that they deserve a pay rise, then like hear why they think they deserve a pay rise, and then you can have that conversation accordingly. But I think if immediately you're sort of trying to find ways to maybe put that conversation off and avoid it, that's not going to be very helpful. So yeah, I think there is an element of letting that person come in and sort of make their case, and then you can respond based on the information they're giving you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because you don't necessarily have to give an answer or respond in that first meeting. And like I said,
Yeah.
I think if it does sound obvious, but you have to just ask the other person to present their case. You have to ask them to present, for example, if there's any data that they've brought with them, why they feel they're being treated unfairly. And I think, like you said, it's asking all of those questions, because we might not be able to make that pay adjustment after that meeting, but hopefully we'll at least be able to demonstrate that they're being treated fairly if we do have a fair approach to pay. So, if you think about, let's say, if that's the advice, and somebody is going to go and have this conversation with somebody in their team, how would you recommend that manager prepares for that conversation? Is there anything they should be doing to prepare before they go and have that actual conversation?
Yeah, I think if you know that conversation's coming, that's really helpful, because you can go away and you can get yourself the data that you need to be able to see where that person's maybe sitting internally compared to other people in similar roles. But you can also ask for external benchmark data. But then you can see where they're sitting, and actually if they are at the point where they should be. And the likelihood is, if someone's approached you wanting to have that conversation, maybe they've found some salary data from somewhere that they're going to be bringing to you. Maybe they've been on Glassdoor or Indeed or something. They've seen a similar role and it's paying more than what they're on. So I think it's really good to make sure that you have the data that you've been working from to back up why the pay point is where it is.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I think that's a critical point around, because you mentioned having internal data, so internal equity, and also external data. But I think what I would also add around the external data is we have to, as HR teams, equip our managers with more external data that is based around job evaluation. Because I always think that, when HR teams are only working with free data that they can go online and look at job ads and recruitment surveys, and they're going back to respond to employees with their own data, all they're saying is, I'm going to use my internet research and not your internet research.
Yeah.
Or my internet
true.
research
That's
is
a
better
really
than
good
your
point.
internet research. But what we should be doing is saying, well, we don't just look at internet data. We evaluate the job, looking at accountability, responsibility, compare it to similar jobs, because job titles are misleading. And I think that's where, as HR, we probably need to get more into making sure our processes are fair, because that makes our job a lot easier when we're communicating and having these conversations.
Oh yeah, vastly, because I think people appreciate reasoning and good reasoning, and if you can explain the reasons or the approach behind pay, and that all makes sense and it seems fair, I think people respect that. But it's really hard to talk to people about their pay if A, you don't really understand that reasoning yourself, or B, that reasoning maybe hasn't been looked at for a while, and maybe it's not up to date, and maybe it doesn't reflect like what your company's really trying to achieve. So that obviously makes it less easy to talk about.
One of the fears that I know a lot of organizations have around pay conversations is, or to be transparent, it's they're thinking everyone's going to talk about pay, everyone will want a pay rise. But do you think, or have you seen any evidence where having more pay conversations, do you think, will actually lead to a fairer approach to pay?
The having the conversations part leads to a fairer approach.
Yes, because if because I guess when employees come to you with a grievance, or they're not happy with their pay, if our response is to try and demonstrate that they are being treated fairly, is that indirectly going to lead us to have fairer pay processes, so that if we're having to have these conversations, it means we have to be able to explain them, which means then we have to make sure that our processes are fair.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. I think it definitely will, because and if those processes aren't fair and you're getting a lot of people approaching you and it's coming up again and again, like, that's quite a good incentive, isn't it, to maybe think, well, maybe there's some things we need to change here. So yeah, I think the more open we can be about it, the more likely it is we're going to end up with some fairer processes.
And I think one of the reasons why we don't really see many conversations taking place in the workplace around pay is that, like I was saying at the start, managers are not trained. They don't have the skills to have these conversations. So what do you think are some of the most common mistakes that people make when they're discussing pay? And how could they be avoided?
Yeah, so I think one of the really common mistakes that we hear from clients a lot is that managers just blame HR, because that's just an easy way to deflect that difficult, unpleasant conversation onto someone else. But that doesn't look that good. That doesn't look good for HR. Also, it doesn't look very good for you as a manager that you don't know how to answer that question. And you should really be the first port of call for that information. I think the other thing as well is just reacting too quickly. Like you said before, if someone approaches you to have that conversation, you don't need to have that whole dialogue in one session. You can simply listen to what they have to say and then be like, okay, I've taken all that down. I'm going to go away. I'm going to go through it, and then we'll have a separate meeting to talk about it, and then you can prepare for it. I think the worst thing to do is to be shifting the blame or shifting the responsibility on someone else, or just being evasive. I think as well, it's really easy to just put them off, keep putting them off, and I think that's only going to cause frustration.
I think that a lot of HR people can identify with the blame. And we see how HR is always given the blame, even in TV shows like The Office and all these ones, where HR is always is always the bad guy. But I guess that as well as shifting the blame, I would say it makes you look really weak as a manager if you are shifting the blame, because it's if somebody said that to me, I would think, well, I guess my manager has no authority, and they're not able to influence anything, even if they're saying to me that they think I should be on a higher salary, but they have no influence because they're not able to do anything about it. So I think it's again, it comes to partly it's education, it's giving them the skills, but also maybe we need to make managers understand that actually it undermines their I guess their authority, because if they're saying, well, I have no influence over this, then maybe my performance isn't that important, because they're not going to be able to influence anything there either if I'm not performing well.
Likewise, HR could just respond in kind and be like, well, this is really something that your manager should be going through with you. I know you're just going back and forth. So yeah, no, it doesn't look good. It's also not fair.
So, speaking of The Office and Toby, the HR rep, do you have a favorite line from The Office?
From The Office? Oh my god.
That you
What a
can
question.
reference?
We didn't prepare for this.
Ah,
Well, I think I know what you would say, but it is a really good line, which is where Michael's talking about Toby and he's like, well, Toby works for corporate, so he's really not part of our family. And also he's divorced, so he's really not part of his family.
yeah, I know that one always makes me laugh because I think it just and these sort of things, I guess, don't really help the perception of HR, right? Because
No.
everyone does see HR as the one delivering bad messages, and
Yeah.
Michael is the manager that all he wants is to be popular. He wants everyone to have fun.
Mm.
And
There's another
yeah.
Oh, sorry, background.
No, I was just going to say, and he just sees HR as the one destroying all of that.
Yeah, but the one time, do you remember there's one time where he's really grateful for Toby, which is when Pam is mad at him for dating her mother, and she's being really hostile to him. And he gets Toby to go and speak to her, and he's like, yeah, like, oh, Toby is a great guy. For that one moment, because he takes that difficult conversation away from him, that's the only time I think he likes Toby.
Yeah. That's not something we're going to cover today in our difficult conversations podcast.
Cool, pleased to hear it.
Yeah, we're going to stick with pay and not having relationship advice on this podcast. One thing we haven't, and I guess this is quite a specific question, but we hear a lot when we're talking about things like benefits. So what are different generational preferences when it comes to benefits? And, Gen Z employees might like certain benefits and value pension less, for example, than baby boomers. There are other differences in the workplace, but do you think that there are generational differences that affects attitudes around discussing pay in the workplace? And is that something that managers and HR should be taking into account?
Well, I mean, there definitely is like a stronger call for pay transparency from Gen Z millennials. I don't think that's going to impact like how you would have that conversation. You're still going to have that as a face-to-face conversation with someone, regardless of what generation they fall into. But it's possible that Gen Z millennials might be more likely to approach you with some data that they've found. So again, I think it just comes back to the point of making sure that you have your own data and that data you can explain like why you've based it on that data. So again, like you said, it's not just my data is better than your data. But yeah, again, I think that just comes back to the preparation, which should really be happening for any person that is approaching you to talk about pay, so that you can justify the reasoning, make sure it's clear.
Yeah, I think there's also I think there's a justification for why a lot of managers avoid having pay conversations. It's not just that they don't want to. I think it's because they don't know how to answer some questions because they don't know how pay works in their organization. So, I can think of a question that most organizations that we speak to don't have an answer to. So, for example, if you have a salary range of 40 to 50,000 and you recruit somebody at 40,000 and they come to your manager and say, oh, why am I at the bottom of this range? What do I need to do to move to the top of the range? And that's not something that's very clear for a lot of people, a lot of roles. So I think there's a big piece around what you said earlier, making sure that our pay processes are fair. But it's not just about fairness, because sometimes we can, think in our heads, oh, our approach to pay is fair. But we have to be able to clearly articulate that and explain to people why we make certain decisions. And I guess that comes into your job around the comms piece and explaining some of these concepts. So when we, when we explain things like pay ranges, pay progression to our clients, I have to say we've seen a big difference between when we sometimes in the reward team that are so focused on the technical side of things try and explain these things, as opposed to when you try and explain it, which is much simpler language. So what would your advice be to an HR or a reward team that is looking to explain technical pay aspects, pay structures to their employees or managers? What are the top tips that you would provide to say this is what you should think about when communicating this to employees?
Yeah, I think it is worth if you have your processes and your frameworks, and those are all just internal documents sort of with HR written maybe in HR speak. I think it is worth making available some documents that are written in a broader way that people are going to be able to understand. A lot of terms, even terms that maybe we don't think are like that unusual, like upper quartile, lower quartile, that for a lot of people these are really new terms that maybe they've not come across before. So I know that with a lot of our comms work that we do, we might include like a glossary or like definitions boxes that just explain some of the terms as they're being used. But yeah, I think using clear, straightforward language is really, really important, and finding different ways to format that information so that people can take it in quickly. I think the worst thing you could possibly do is just to send around a massive document that's like 20, 30 pages long of just text. So I think if you just do the opposite of that, like a lot
20,
of
30
visuals,
pages
just
of pictures.
many fewer pages that are heavily visual, using diagrams, just finding other ways to show how things work that doesn't take up a lot of people's time, crucially, because I think people, are generally busy and don't want to sit and read a massive long document. They just want to know how it applies to them, how it's likely to affect them, what it means for them now and in the future. And I think so often when I'm designing documents for comms, I often think, when I'm looking at a page, I'm like, if someone takes just one thing from this page, one or two things, what are those things that they need to take from this page? Because a lot of people as well, you have to think, a lot of people tend to just scan through things. So you've just got to find ways of making things stick out. So it's a whole different operation really to the actual written process, which might be quite in depth, versus what's the information that people want to know and what's the quickest way you can give it to them.
And I guess the other thing that I noticed is sometimes the language that gets used, because I sometimes pick this up, because I didn't grow up or go to school in the UK, and sometimes you use certain terms, like not you, but we in the workplace, we use certain terms or phrases that are, I guess, maybe British phrases or more Western phrases. That we talked about generational differences, but there are many different, cultures and ethnicities in the workplace, and some of those phrases just make no sense to people. And
that's a really good point.
Yeah. Do you have examples of things like that?
Well, I'm just thinking, it's idioms, isn't it? It's like, and I think, and idioms like often get used, you can use them without even thinking about it, because often they're like so ingrained in like that cultural language. And I've seen a few posts recently that have been like comparing idioms just from in between different European countries. They're just things like you've never heard of before, and you wouldn't know what that meant unless you from that culture. So I think as a general rule, I try not to use idioms for that reason, because I think sometimes it can just cause confusion where there doesn't need to be confusion, and maybe you're just phrasing it that way because it sounds nice. But yeah, I would, for that reason, avoid them, because like you say, maybe if someone isn't a native British speaker, or their English is really great, but they've just never come across that phrase before, like it's just causing unnecessary confusion. That, and I would say like too much corporate jargon. There's a lot of, you get a lot of these documents maybe come to you in their early stages, and there can be a lot of corporate jargon in there that just doesn't need to be written like that. I always just think, what's the most straightforward way of saying the thing?
Can you think of examples
of idioms
or corporate jargon that you think that we tend to use very commonly, and we should, I think maybe even 70-80% of the population might think, oh, but yeah, this is something I hear all the time, so I don't see an issue with it. But the other 20% might be thinking, well, I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, but I feel like there is, but you put me on the spot, and now like nothing is in my brain.
I can give you an example, which is going to make me look really stupid. But I remember when I think I was relatively new in the UK at the time, and this is my first job, and all the comms in the company, not all the comms, I think there were like 2 different letters that I'd received, and in there the example would always say, Joe Blogs is on this, and in the other letter it says Joe Blogs, and I just remember asking somebody in the kitchen once, who's this Joe Blogs person that I always keep reading about? I've never seen them in the office. And then they were just laughing, thinking, oh no, this is not a real person, this is just some expression that we use. It's like, just mean anyone. I was thinking, why don't we just say employee A, employee B? Why Joe Blogs?
Yeah, it's true. It's not even like Blogs is a well-known surname. Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, why would you know that?
So yeah, and I think that's the sort of thing that just for a lot of people it's like, oh, this is obvious, but I was confused for weeks.
It's tricky because it often is really second nature to use idioms in writing. So it's worth almost doing with your proofreading. Are you writing, say, out to employees, just doing a bit of an idiom check?
One of the things I think is coming up more and more is conversations around pay in the interview process. And for a lot of people, because the pay conversations is difficult for managers, but actually it's so much more difficult for somebody going to an interview, because they are trying to impress the people interviewing them. They're trying not to say something that might be taken as a negative, and still they're being asked questions which could potentially lead to unfair pay practices, like, what do you currently get paid? Which should, I think some people, I used to get very angry comments when I first started mentioning this like 10 years ago, but still some managers get annoyed thinking, well, I need to ask this question, because what if I offer a salary that is lower than what they currently get paid? But not thinking about the impact that this is going to have on internal equity and everyone else. So not having a fair process. But we know that this is coming in the EU directive, for example, but that's 2 years away, where organizations are going to be banned from asking this question to candidates in the interview process. And so while this is coming in, I'm sure that, plus, with Brexit, this doesn't apply to the UK unless the government brings something in. What advice can we give to candidates to say, if you do get asked this question, how can you respond to it? So I've got some advice on this, but I'm also keen to hear what your advice would be to candidates in this situation.
Well, I think, yeah, it's really difficult, because I think the thing that worries people about this is coming across as like difficult. But I think a fair thing to say if someone asks you what your salary expectations are is to counter with, do you have a pay range for this role? Which they should. And then you can say something like, I expect to be placed within that range based on the skills and experience that I bring. Something like that, however you would say it. But I think, yeah, you are under no obligation to, and shouldn't really be sharing what you're on now, because it's not relevant.
Yeah, it's so I completely agree, because like you said, the way organizations should be making decisions from a pay perspective is, one, what are they willing to offer for that job, for that role? What is the range? And then they look at the person they're interviewing to decide where they think they fit within that range based on their unique knowledge, skills, and experience. But there are still companies and interviewers that really push for that information. They'll say, well, no, we need to know what you get paid. It's a question we need to ask everyone. So I agree with exactly what you said, this is what you say. But I think if they really push for an answer, I always recommend saying something like, I feel I'm currently underpaid in my job, and that's one of the reasons why I'm looking to leave and I'm looking for a new job. So I don't want my current salary to influence how I get paid in the future, and I would like to be paid fairly based on what you're willing to offer, like what you said earlier. And I think that hopefully will be good enough for a lot of interviews. And there is no doubt that there were some people that will just insist, saying, no, I need a number. And I always think,
I just think, do you want to work for those? Do you want to work for those ones? If that's their approach, like, they're telling you something about that company's culture right there, aren't they?
Yeah, I think when we're looking for jobs, we can all be very keen to, just find whatever we can, because we've got our bills to pay and everything. But I think as long as we're able to, it's important not to just be blinded by that, oh, I need to find something regardless of anything, but to watch out for some of these red flags in the interview process. Because if they're trying to force you to answer that question in an interview before you've even joined, I think could be signs of what's to come once you do join, and how they might treat you. And because if they can't treat you fairly in an interview process, then if you're underpaid, then there's going to be no desire to make sure that you're paid fairly.
Absolutely. How do you think the next pay conversation that you have with them is going to go, if that's the first one?
Yeah. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all the podcast guests, which is, what is your favorite film?
I don't really have a favorite film, but I watch a lot of comedy films. Film I really like is What We Do in the Shadows, not the series, but the original film with
the guys from
Flight of the
Conchords
and Jermaine Clements.
Yeah.
I really like that film. It's really silly.
Yeah, no, they. I mean, Flight of the Conchords was one of the best series, wasn't it? And they're very funny. Okay, yeah. I think that's. I've seen that as well, and if you enjoy a good comedy, would definitely recommend that one. But there's a film that came to my mind earlier when we were talking, and I don't know if you've seen. It's called Talladega Nights with Will Ferrell, and Sacha Baron Cohen is in there as well. He's playing it's about Formula One. He's playing a French Formula One driver, and Will Ferrell plays this really. I'm not making any comparisons, but he plays this really stupid Formula One driver, and he's he's called Ricky Bobby with two first names, and he's giving a television interview. And in the interview, because he's so inexperienced, he doesn't know what to do. He keeps putting his hands up like this when he's talking in an interview, and then he says, "Oh, I'm not sure what to do with my hands." And it reminded me because you were doing that earlier. When you were on
I
the
was just about
podcast
to say I
saying-
was doing this earlier. I was like doing this for ages, like stirring some sort of weird soup.
I know.
Yeah,
It reminded me of Talladega Nights and that scene. So if anyone wants to see Will Ferrell doing an impression of Jenna, then Talladega Nights is the film to watch.
That reminds me of a sketch from that Mitchell and Webb look where there's a history presenter talking about planes or something, and he can't speak without doing this. And every time they do a take, he's like, "And it was here in these guys, the Luftwaffe was defeated." And they're like, "Can you just bring?" And he can't. And then they have to strap him to a board.
Was that Mitchell who was doing that?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like him doing that sort of thing. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Jenna, for your insights. I think there's so much to think about when we're having pay conversations, but I mean, to summarize, I think what we're saying is it's a crucial part of being a manager. Every manager should have some training on how to have pay conversations, but part of the reasons that they avoid these conversations is because they are not given the right tools, the skills, and the information to be able to explain to employees why their pay is managed in a fair way, what are the pay principles and philosophy of the organization, and how decisions are made to make sure that it's consistent for everyone in the organization. So really, that's the first step, is having your, like Simon Sinek says, starting with why, having your pay philosophy, and then making sure that the policies and processes are there, and then giving managers the training to be able to have that conversation with people. So thanks again, Jenna. I hope you found this useful. If anyone wants to connect with you, Jenna, what is the best way to do that?
By email at jenna@3r-strategy.com.
And
or
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Jenna Thompson on LinkedIn.
So feel free to connect with Jenna directly if you want some more tips, advice, if you have any questions, and tune in for our next episode of A Case of the Mondays. Speak to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
You've been listening to A Case of the Mondays. Feel free to share this episode with anyone you think might find it useful. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or would like to suggest a topic for future episodes, get in touch by emailing podcast@3r-strategy.com or head over to 3r-strategy.com to sign up to our mailing list for regular news and updates.